I need you to pretend to be my wife, the millionaire doctor said, his voice calm, but carrying an undeniable weight. Lena froze. She could hardly believe the words that came out of his mouth. Why her? A struggling artist, barely making ends meet. This couldn't be real. Lena Wright, a talented but underappreciated artist, found herself trapped in a life she never imagined. Her passion for painting was slowly suffocated by her need to survive, working endless hours at a local diner to pay rent and cover her mounting bills. The dream she had for herself, to live off her art, to create something meaningful, seemed more like a distant memory than a future she could still reach. Yet here she was, day after day, serving food to customers who didn't even glance at her beyond their orders. It was at one of these mundane nights, after her shift had ended, that her world tilted on its axis. A friend of a friend had dragged her along to an art exhibition she didn't even want to attend. She had promised herself she would stay home and finish a new painting. But there she was, standing in the corner of a posh gallery, surrounded by paintings she could barely afford to touch, let alone exhibit. The gallery buzzed with the usual crowd of critics, curators, and wealthy donors, all of them dressed in stiff, perfect clothes. That's when she saw him, Dr. Marcus Anderson, a name that had floated through the whispers of the medical community for years. He was a renowned neurosurgeon, hailed as a genius in his field. But more than that, he was a man surrounded by an aura of cold detachment. His reputation was flawless, his persona flawless. The kind of person Lena had always imagined herself too ordinary to ever meet, let alone interact with. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, Lena could have sworn she saw something unusual in his gaze. A fleeting moment of recognition, or perhaps it was just the way his eyes scanned the room, as if everything and everyone were a puzzle to solve. Lena quickly averted her eyes, instinctively retreating into the safe anonymity of the crowd. But it wasn't long before Marcus approached her, his presence making the gallery seem smaller, quieter. "You're an artist, aren't you?" His voice was smooth, effortlessly commanding, yet oddly soft. Lena nodded, surprised by the attention, but before she could respond, he continued, "I've seen your work." She stiffened. "Really? Where?" "In a gallery downtown," he said, his smile subtle. "You're talented. It's just unfortunate that your talent hasn't been recognized yet. But maybe I can change that." Lena laughed lightly, unsure of how to respond. "I'm just trying to make ends meet." His expression shifted, as though he was calculating something. "I understand. I know how that feels." His gaze lingered for a moment longer, and there was a hint of something unreadable in his eyes. "I have a proposition for you, Lena." The words seemed to hang in the air between them, as if time slowed, but before she could ask him to clarify, he spoke again. "I need you to pretend to be my wife." Lena blinked. The words hit her like a shockwave, and she almost laughed, thinking he was joking. But the icy seriousness in his gaze told her this wasn't a joke. "What?" His voice remained steady, unflinching. "I need you to pose as my wife for a week. It's part of a deal that could impact my future career. It's strictly professional, no emotions involved." Lena's mind spun, her heart pounding in her chest. The idea was absurd. He was a millionaire, a doctor with a world-renowned reputation. What could he possibly need from someone like her, a struggling artist? And why had he chosen her of all people? "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, unsure if she even wanted to hear the answer. "Because you're the only one I can trust, and I need someone who isn't involved in my world." He looked around the room briefly, as if to make sure no one was listening. "Someone who won't ask questions." Lena felt a chill run down her spine. The way he said it, with such cold certainty, unnerved her. She should have walked away, turned him down, and never looked back. But something in his gaze, something about the way he looked at her, made her hesitate. She could hear the weight of her unpaid bills, the rent due next week, her mom's medical bills hanging over her like a storm cloud. Marcus must have sensed her hesitation because he spoke again, this time lowering his voice even further. "I'll pay you. Enough to get your life back on track. Enough to cover your mother's bills." The words landed with the force of a bomb, and suddenly, Lena was aware of just how much she needed something to change. A week. Just 1 week. No emotions. No strings attached. She could do that, right? Before she could stop herself, the words tumbled out. "Okay, I'll do it." He smiled, a small but calculated smile, as if he already knew her answer. Lena's hands trembled as she gripped the door handle of her cramped apartment, the faint echo of Dr. Marcus Anderson's words still ringing in her ears. She had agreed to his bizarre request, but now that the reality of it was settling in, she wasn't sure what she had just signed herself up for. Her studio apartment was as messy as her thoughts. Half-finished canvases cluttered the space, the remnants of ideas that had been abandoned, projects she never found the time to complete. The only constant was the overwhelming sense of exhaustion that hung over her. Each shift at the diner, each unpaid bill, each failed art show, it all piled up in her mind like a heavy weight she couldn't escape. The soft buzz of her phone broke her from her thoughts. It was an email notification, her landlord reminding her once again that her rent was overdue. She ignored it. It felt like the same old story. Her mind wandered back to Marcus, the millionaire doctor with the cold eyes and the intriguing proposition. Why her? What did he really want? She wasn't naive enough to think this wasn't going to come with strings attached. But then again, what choice did she have? As the rain began to pour outside, she sat down at her easel and stared at the blank canvas in front of her. The paintbrush hovered in the air, but for the first time in a long time, she couldn't bring herself to start. What was the point? It was then that she heard the knock at her door. The sound startled her, and for a moment, she wondered if she had imagined it. But when she opened the door, the last thing she expected was the tall figure of a man standing there, his sharp features almost as cold as the storm outside. "Lena Wright?" he asked, his voice low and steady. It was the same voice that had made her heart race hours earlier. She swallowed, trying to steady her breath. "Yes, that's me." He handed her an envelope without another word. Inside, she found a plane ticket, a hotel reservation, and a note. "We begin tomorrow." Her heart skipped a beat. This was real. With one final glance at the night sky, Lena closed the door behind her, bracing herself for the unknown. This would be the beginning of something that would change everything. A game she didn't know how to play, but couldn't back out of now. The next day, Lena found herself standing in front of a small hotel room in the heart of the city, feeling the weight of Dr. Marcus Anderson's proposition hanging over her like a cloud she couldn't shake. She had told herself she would go through with it, that it was just a week, a temporary escape from the mess she had made of her life. But as she clutched the envelope in her hand, the reality of what she was about to do hit her harder than she expected. Her phone buzzed again, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Marcus. "We meet tonight. Dress appropriately. We'll have dinner with my colleagues." The message was brief, but it carried a certain finality, as if he expected her to be ready, no questions asked. Lena stared at the message for a long moment. Dress appropriately. Was that a warning, or just his way of asserting control? She shoved the phone back in her pocket, frustrated with herself for even considering the implications of it all. She had made her choice. She just had to follow through. By the time evening arrived, Lena was dressed in the finest clothes she had ever worn. A tailored black dress, sleek and simple, nothing too flashy, but polished enough to pass for someone who belonged in this world. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting her hair, wondering if she could pull off this charade. Could she really pretend to be a wife, to play a part she wasn't sure she understood? A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find a man in a sharp suit, his face neutral. "Ms. Wright?" he asked. She nodded. "Dr. Anderson is expecting you. Please follow me." He didn't offer a smile, just a slight motion of his head, a gesture that felt more like an order than an invitation. Lena followed him through the hallway, her heels clicking on the polished marble floor. She could hear the hum of the city outside, muffled through the thick walls of the building, but it felt like the world had shrunk down to just the two of them. She was walking into the unknown, but she had no choice now but to keep moving forward. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and the man stepped aside, allowing her to enter first. The ride up was silent, the tension between them palpable. When they finally reached the top floor, he led her through a set of grand doors into a dining room that could have been mistaken for a palace. Dr. Marcus Anderson stood by the window, looking out over the city. His silhouette was strong, commanding, and the moment he turned to face her, Lena felt the full force of his presence. His dark eyes swept over her, taking in her appearance without saying a word. He was dressed in a tailored suit, his usual sharp, immaculate look, but tonight there was something different about him. His usual ice-cold demeanor was there, but it was somehow more fragile. "You're here," he said, his voice low, almost a murmur. "Yes," Lena replied, her voice betraying a mix of nerves and curiosity. He gestured toward the long dining table where two other figures sat, a man and a woman, both dressed in high-end business attire. The man was tall, with a serious expression, and the woman had sharp features that were both striking and unapproachable. Lena couldn't help but feel out of place as she walked toward them, her feet hesitant on the polished floor. "Lena, this is Claire and Thomas," Dr. Anderson introduced them, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're part of the board I mentioned. We're just here to discuss a few details." Lena nodded politely, her stomach churning. This was real now. She was a part of this world, even if just for a week. Claire gave her a cold smile, but Thomas barely acknowledged her presence, his gaze already turning to the paperwork in front of him. The tension in the room thickened, and Lena found herself unsure of where to sit. "Please join us," Dr. Anderson said, pulling out the chair next to him. She sat down, the silence stretching between them. The dinner began, but Lena couldn't focus on the food, the conversations, or the polite pleasantries. Her mind kept drifting back to the strange proposition Marcus had made. Pretend to be his wife. Was this just a business deal for him? Or was there more to it? As the evening wore on, her discomfort grew. Claire and Thomas spoke in hushed tones, their words incomprehensible to Lena. She caught snippets, something about the future of the hospital's charity, the upcoming board meetings, the importance of family values, but nothing seemed to fit together. All she could focus on was Dr. Anderson, sitting beside her, his eyes constantly on her, as though he was measuring her every move. She was sure he knew what she was thinking. She just wasn't sure if he wanted her to stop thinking. The following morning, Lena found herself back in the hotel room, her thoughts spinning. The dinner had been nothing like she expected. There was an air of secrecy hanging over it all, as if she were being tested, evaluated not as a wife, but as a piece in a much larger game. And she still didn't know the rules. As she sat by the window, staring out at the quiet street below, the knock at her door startled her. She opened it to find a woman standing in the hallway, a briefcase in her hands. She was young, with sharp features and dark eyes that looked like they had seen too much. "Lena Wright?" she asked, her voice low but strong. Lena nodded, her curiosity piqued. The woman stepped forward without waiting for an invitation, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. "I'm Clara," the woman said, her gaze flicking around the room as if she were searching for something Lena couldn't see. "I'm here about the arrangement." The weight in her voice made Lena freeze. "What do you mean?" Clara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she set her briefcase down on the table, and her eyes met Lena's. There was something in the way she looked at her, something familiar yet unsettling, that made Lena's heart race. "I know why you're here," Clara said, her tone flat. "And I know exactly what you've gotten yourself into. But I need you to understand, this isn't just a business deal for Marcus. This is about something much bigger." Lena's throat tightened. "What are you talking about?" Clara stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I'm here because there's something you don't know about him, something that connects you to this whole mess. And I think you're going to find out soon enough." Lena stared at Clara, confusion swirling in her mind. She had no idea what Clara was talking about, but a deep sense of unease began to settle in her chest. "I just need the remains," Clara added, her voice barely above a whisper, before she turned and left the room, leaving Lena to wonder how much of this strange situation was just a lie, and how much of it was somehow connected to her. As the door closed behind her, Lena felt a chill crawl up her spine. What was Clara really after? And why did it feel like this story was much darker than Marcus had let on? The door clicked shut behind Clara, leaving Lena alone in the dimly lit hotel room with only the unsettling words she had just heard echoing in her mind. Something about Clara's visit, the way she spoke, the cryptic warning, didn't sit right with her. It was one thing to pretend to be a wife for a week, but this felt like something much bigger than what she had signed up for. Lena took a deep breath and grabbed her phone, hoping to distract herself by scrolling through social media. It was a futile attempt to push away the gnawing feeling that she was being drawn into a mystery she wasn't prepared for. She had agreed to this job under the premise that it would solve her immediate financial problems, that it would give her the chance to focus on her art without the constant burden of bills hanging over her head. But now, with Clara's ominous words lingering, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being used for something more sinister. She glanced over at the briefcase Clara had left on the table. It was unopened, still locked in a way that seemed deliberate. The unease crept up again, but Lena couldn't resist the pull of curiosity. She walked over to the case, her fingers brushing the cold metal latch. With one swift motion, she unlocked it and opened it. Inside was a folder filled with documents. At the top of the first page was a name she didn't recognize, Nathaniel Voss. The name sounded familiar, but Lena couldn't place it. She shuffled through the papers, her eyes scanning the typed notes. There was mention of criminal investigations, mysterious disappearances, and a botched autopsy. The words seemed out of place for someone who had just been cremated, but the connection wasn't immediately clear. The papers told a story she hadn't expected. Nathaniel Voss wasn't just some anonymous body to be disposed of. The records mentioned multiple investigations tied to his name, corruption, fraud, and a string of deaths that had never been fully explained. Lena's mind raced. Why would someone like Dr. Anderson want her involved in this? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. It was Marcus. He stepped into the room without waiting for an invitation, his eyes briefly flicking to the open briefcase. "I see you found it," he said, his voice steady but lacking its usual confidence. Lena stood up, instinctively pushing the folder aside. "Found what? What is all this?" Marcus closed the door behind him, his eyes locking onto hers. There was something different in his gaze, a vulnerability, a crack in his controlled exterior. "It's about Nathaniel Voss," he said, his voice low. "You were never supposed to get involved in this. But now that you've seen what's in that folder, I can't ignore the fact that you know too much." Lena swallowed, her heartbeat quickening. What does Clara have to do with this? Why did she come here? Marcus ran a hand through his hair, pacing across the room. Clara's father, Nathaniel, was involved in something far more dangerous than you realize. His death wasn't just a tragedy. It was part of a much larger conspiracy. And now, it's on my shoulders to clean up the mess. Lena felt her stomach twist. "But that man, the one you had cremated, that wasn't Nathaniel Voss, was it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Those weren't his ashes." Marcus hesitated, and in that moment Lena knew. She had been right all along. "No," Marcus admitted, his tone heavy. "The body you cremated was someone who assumed Nathaniel's identity. I don't know who he was, but Clara believes he was part of something far bigger. The real Nathaniel, he's gone. But the people who were involved in his dealings, they're still out there. And they won't stop until everything is buried." Lena's head spun. She had thought she was just playing a role in a simple business arrangement, but now she was tangled up in a mess that went deeper than she could have ever imagined. "Why am I involved in this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want from me?" Marcus's eyes softened, and for a fleeting moment, Lena saw the man behind the doctor, the one who wasn't so detached. "I didn't ask you to get involved. But Clara needs answers. She wants to know what happened to her father, to understand why her father's life ended the way it did. And if you're going to stay, you'll need to help us find those answers." Lena's mind was racing. This was no longer about money or appearances. This was something far darker. "Why are you telling me all of this?" she asked, struggling to make sense of it. "Why do you trust me? I'm just some waitress you picked to play the role of your wife." "Because you're the only one I can trust," Marcus said, his gaze intense. "You're the only one who has no history with any of this. The only one who isn't already involved in the mess." Lena felt a knot form in her throat. The idea of getting deeper into this was terrifying. But somehow, she couldn't bring herself to walk away. Not yet. She sat down, running her fingers through her hair, trying to process everything she had learned. It was as though the walls of her carefully constructed life had come crashing down, revealing a world she wasn't prepared to face. But she had already stepped too far into it to turn back. As Marcus continued to speak, Lena's mind drifted to a distant memory, one that seemed oddly connected to the present chaos. She remembered hearing a story years ago, back when she was just starting out as an artist. A friend of a friend had whispered about an investigation involving the cremation of wealthy families. The rumors said that crematoriums, places just like this one, were often used to cover up fraudulent deaths, to erase the traces of people who had been too dangerous to keep alive. The pieces began to fall into place. Marcus's involvement, the botched investigation, the mysterious body. It was all tied together. The rumors she had heard all those years ago were no longer just rumors. They were real. Lena looked up at Marcus, her voice barely a whisper. "You're telling me that your crematorium was involved in something much bigger than a simple death?" He nodded, his face grim. "I didn't want to believe it either. But the truth is, we're all part of this. And now, we have to finish what we started." Lena sat back, the weight of his words sinking in. This wasn't just a story of betrayal or deceit. This was something that could ruin lives, including hers. "Then let's finish it," she said quietly. "Let's find out who the hell Nathaniel Voss really was." And with that, Lena knew there was no going back. The game had changed. She was no longer just pretending to be Marcus's wife. Now, she was involved in a dangerous investigation, one that would change everything she thought she knew about life, death, and trust. As she looked at Marcus, she couldn't shake the feeling that there were far darker secrets yet to be uncovered. The tension in the crematorium was palpable as Clara stood before Jordan, her face stern, her eyes locked onto his with a determination that made his skin crawl. He had always known his work as a crematorium operator was macabre, but this was something different, something darker. "You need to exhume a body," Clara said flatly, her voice cold but edged with an urgency that sent a shiver down his spine. Jordan blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "Exhume a body," he repeated, his voice strained. "Why? We don't handle that here." Clara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a step closer, her gaze never wavering. "The body you cremated last week was a cover-up. The man whose ashes you processed wasn't Nathaniel Voss. It was someone else, someone connected to Nathaniel's past. And I need you to help me uncover the truth." Jordan's mind raced. He had been involved in enough questionable activities in his years of working at the crematorium. But exhuming a body? That crossed a line he wasn't sure he wanted to cross. "You want me to dig up someone's grave?" His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, but he couldn't hide the confusion and growing apprehension. "What makes you think I have the authority or the right to do that?" Clara's lips tightened into a thin line. "You have the access. You work here. And if you want the truth about Nathaniel, about what really happened, you have to do this." Her words hung in the air between them, like a challenge he wasn't sure he was ready to accept. But her eyes, cold and determined, seemed to leave him with no choice. Jordan swallowed hard, the unease in his chest growing. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him, the consequences of what would happen if he followed through. "What if I don't do it?" Jordan asked, his voice low, testing the waters. He didn't know if he could stomach this any further. He had always worked in the shadows, but this was something entirely different. Clara's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "Then you'll never know what really happened to Nathaniel. You'll never uncover the conspiracy that's buried with him. But more than that, you'll never understand how deep this goes. And trust me, Jordan, it's deeper than you can imagine." The words struck him like a punch to the gut. He hadn't realized just how much he was being pulled into this mess. The bodies he'd handled, the cremations he'd performed, they were all just numbers to him, a part of his job. But this felt like something far more personal. Jordan sat in his small office. The door cracked open just enough to let the light from the hallway filter in. He stared blankly at the file in front of him, the papers detailing the deceased and his supposed accident. According to the records, the man had died in a car crash, a simple, straightforward case that had been handled without incident. Or so it seemed. He wasn't sure when it happened, but somewhere along the line, Jordan had stopped asking questions about the bodies he cremated. He had seen so much death, so much pain, that it became easier to just close his eyes and perform the rituals. But now, with Clara's words echoing in his mind, the entire industry he had once felt indifferent about felt like a house of cards about to fall. What did he really know about the bodies he handled? How many had been misidentified? How many deaths had been covered up? Jordan thought back to the whispered rumors he'd heard over the years. Stories about crematoriums being used to erase inconvenient truths, to hide the evidence of crimes committed by the wealthy and powerful. He had dismissed them at the time, assuming they were just stories, urban legends shared by people who had too much time on their hands. But now, those stories were all coming back, and he had to admit to himself that some of them were probably true. His own crematorium had been involved in more than just simple cremations. It had been part of a much larger operation, an operation that Jordan hadn't wanted to believe existed. And now, as he sat here, he realized that he was stuck in the middle of it. The truth, the real truth, was slipping through his fingers, just like the ashes he had so carefully processed over the years. The weight of his complicity in it all was sinking in, and Jordan couldn't help but feel like he was drowning in it. The next morning, after a sleepless night filled with restless thoughts, Jordan couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of urgency any longer. Clara's request, no, her demand, had been clear. Exhuming the body was the only way to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that she was right. If he wanted to understand what had happened to Nathaniel Voss, if he wanted to untangle the mess he had become entangled in, he would have to confront the very thing he had avoided for years, the truth about his job and his role in hiding it. Jordan spent the morning poring over the case files again, his mind racing. The records had seemed so ordinary at first. A simple car accident, a quick cremation, an easy paycheck. But as he flipped through the papers, something didn't add up. There were inconsistencies, small details that didn't quite fit. The man who had supposedly died in the crash didn't match the description in the records. There were no fingerprints on file, no identification to confirm his identity. It was as though the system had been designed to erase him. Jordan's heart pounded as he flipped through the pages, uncovering more and more irregularities. The deeper he dug, the more he realized just how much had been covered up. There were references to high-profile individuals, to powerful families who had been involved in a web of corruption and deceit. And now, his crematorium was a part of that web. He looked up from the files, his mind spinning. It was all connected, the mysterious body, Nathaniel Voss, the wealthy families, the cover-ups. He was knee-deep in something much bigger than he had ever anticipated. His colleagues, the ones who worked alongside him, had been a part of it too. They had helped stage the death scenes, helped cover up the evidence. Jordan's stomach turned as he realized that he had been complicit in all of it. His silence, his indifference, had made him a part of the problem. But no more. The decision to exhumate the body wasn't just about uncovering the truth for Clara. It was about redeeming himself. It was about taking back control, about standing up against the system he had allowed to consume him. But Jordan knew that whatever he uncovered in that grave would change everything. The consequences would be irreversible, and there would be no going back. As the day wore on, the tension continued to build. Jordan couldn't shake the feeling that he was running out of time. He needed to act, and soon. But the deeper he went, the more dangerous the truth became. And soon, he would have to decide if he was ready to face it head-on, or if he would remain a silent witness to the lies. The walls of the crematorium had never seemed as suffocating as they did now. Jordan sat in his small office, The files he'd been poring over scattered across the desk, each one more damning than the last. The weight of his discovery hung over him like a dark cloud, one he couldn't escape. Clara's presence in the crematorium was like an anchor to a sinking ship, tethering him to something he had never intended to be a part of. But now, with every file he uncovered, with every piece of information he unearthed, the truth was becoming undeniable. Nathaniel Voss hadn't just been another wealthy client. He had been a key player in something far more dangerous, something that went beyond his initial understanding. Lena's body tensed as she picked up the folder, flipping through the pages one more time. Every document that came with it painted a clearer picture. Voss wasn't a victim. He was an architect of corruption, a man whose life had been a carefully constructed facade, much like the wealthy families whose names had been tied to him. And the death that had supposedly ended it all? It was nothing more than an elaborate cover-up. The documents revealed a network of fraud, multi-million-dollar deals, and an intricate system of corruption that spanned across powerful families in the city. Nathaniel had been at the heart of it all. His death, the one that had brought Clara here in the first place, was simply a way to protect the truth. The body Jordan had cremated wasn't even Nathaniel's. It was someone else, someone who had been disposed of to erase the evidence of Nathaniel's betrayal. The ashes he had prepared weren't those of the man whose name had been on the file. They were the remnants of a forgotten man, a faceless body that had taken Voss's place in death. Jordan's hands trembled as he set the file down. A part of him had hoped he was wrong, hoped that the pieces wouldn't fit together like this. But they had. The truth was uglier than he could have ever imagined. And it was too late to turn back now. Clara watched him, her gaze unwavering, as the full weight of the truth settled in. She had been silent for most of the day, letting Jordan dig through the records. But now it was her turn to speak. "I knew he wasn't dead," Clara said quietly, her voice distant. The words were heavy, laden with years of grief. "I knew the man you cremated wasn't my father. But I didn't have proof. Not until now." Jordan turned to look at her, his eyes narrowing in confusion. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, the frustration in his voice rising. "Why make me go through all of this?" Clara let out a long breath, her shoulders slumping as she walked over to the window, staring out at the cemetery beyond. "Because I wasn't sure who to trust. And because I didn't want anyone else to get hurt. My father's death was never meant to be a mystery. It was supposed to be a secret that kept everyone involved safe." Jordan's confusion deepened. He didn't know what she meant by safe, but he could tell by the sharpness in her eyes that the story she was about to tell would change everything. "My father, Nathaniel, was a part of something much bigger than anyone ever realized," Clara continued, her voice steady but filled with a quiet rage. "He wasn't just a businessman. He was the one pulling the strings for a whole network of families. The ones who are still running things today. And when he tried to get out, when he realized what they were really doing, they killed him. They made it look like an accident. But they didn't count on me." Jordan sat back, his breath catching in his throat. "You're saying your father was murdered?" Clara nodded. "Yes. And when I found out, I swore I would uncover the truth. But I had to do it carefully. These people don't just disappear, Jordan. They make sure you're buried with them if you try to cross them. So I waited. I gathered evidence. And then I found you." Her words hung in the air, and Jordan felt a chill creep over him. He had always known his job was dangerous, but this was something far beyond what he had ever signed up for. Jordan's mind was spinning. He had been dragged into this under the guise of a simple task, a cremation, a favor for a grieving daughter. But now he was fully implicated in something he couldn't ignore. His job, his role as an operator, had always felt impersonal. The bodies he handled were just that, bodies. Nothing more. But now, as he sifted through the grim records Clara had shown him, he realized that his work wasn't just a passive job. He had been part of a cover-up. His crematorium was a cog in the machine that had helped erase the past of powerful people who had ties to murder, fraud, and deceit. Jordan had always prided himself on being detached. His role was to process, to handle the ashes, to send people off quietly. He wasn't supposed to ask questions, wasn't supposed to care. But now, as the reality of his involvement sank in, he couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of guilt that threatened to consume him. He had been a silent witness to crimes he hadn't wanted to see. And now, the truth was forcing its way into his life, whether he was ready for it or not. "You've crossed a line, Jordan," Clara's voice broke through his thoughts, and he turned to face her again. She was standing by the table, her hands trembling slightly. "You're in this now. And if you're not careful, you'll be just as buried as the people who tried to bury my father." Jordan swallowed hard, his eyes locking with hers. "What do I do now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara's gaze softened, but there was no sympathy in it, only determination. "We finish this," she said firmly. "We find out who's responsible for Nathaniel's death, and we expose them. But you have to make a choice, Jordan. You're either with me, or you're with them. There's no middle ground." Jordan closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of her words settle deep within him. He had thought he could walk away from this, that he could just do his job and move on. But now, there was no going back. The truth was out there, and it was going to cost him everything. He stood up slowly, his body stiff with the realization that his life was about to change forever. "Let's uncover the rest of the story," he said quietly, the finality in his tone echoing through the room. Clara nodded, her expression hardening as she stepped closer. "The first step is exhuming the body. After that, we'll have everything we need." Jordan's heart sank as he realized the full weight of what he had just agreed to. This wasn't just about finding the truth. It was about risking everything, his job, his safety, even his life. But there was no turning back now. The lies were buried too deep, and the only way out was to dig them all up. The late-night hours had become a blur of worry and paranoia for Jordan. The once calm, methodical rhythm of his life had been shattered, replaced by an anxiety that gnawed at him like a relentless predator. Every creak of the floorboards, every knock on the door, sent him spiraling into panic. He couldn't escape the mounting pressure, the growing realization that his world was no longer his own. The threats had started small. Anonymous phone calls, a letter slipped under the door, cryptic messages that barely made sense but still carried an undeniable weight. "Stop digging or else." The words lingered in his mind long after they were spoken. He had ignored them at first, thinking they were nothing more than idle threats meant to scare him into compliance. But as the days went on, the messages grew more direct, more personal. His phone rang again, the screen flashing an unknown number. Jordan's heart skipped. He didn't want to answer it, but he knew he had no choice. "Mr. Pierce," the voice on the other end of the line said, cold and smooth, "you've gotten yourself involved in something you don't understand. The consequences for digging up the past are severe. Consider this your final warning. If you continue, your career, your safety, and the lives of those around you will be at risk." The voice hung up before Jordan could respond, leaving him standing in the middle of his small office, feeling as though the walls were closing in. He had thought the truth would set him free, that uncovering Nathaniel's secrets would bring justice. But now he realized just how far-reaching the consequences would be. This was no longer just about a job. His life was on the line. Jordan's once solid world was starting to crumble. Every night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He couldn't sleep. The fear gnawed at him, a constant hum in the background of his thoughts. He had tried to convince himself that this was all just part of the game, a brief moment of discomfort in an otherwise safe life. But the threats weren't stopping, and neither were the warnings. His colleagues at the crematorium had begun to look at him differently. Whispers followed him through the halls, and the weight of their stares made his skin crawl. Jordan had always been the quiet one, the man who kept his head down and did his job without asking too many questions. But now, people were starting to notice him, and it wasn't for any of the right reasons. It wasn't just the threats that were eating at him. It was the toll the entire situation was taking on his sense of self. The line between his professional duties and personal safety had become so blurred that he didn't know where one ended and the other began. Every body he cremated, every file he processed, every innocent person he'd helped dispose of, they all felt like they were pushing him closer to the edge. He had been a silent participant for so long, but now that silence was suffocating him. And Clara, she was the only person left who seemed to understand what was at stake. But her single-minded determination to expose the truth was dragging them both deeper into a hole from which there was no escape. She had become his anchor, the one person who kept pushing him forward when all he wanted to do was run. The problem was, he wasn't sure anymore if he was helping her for the right reasons. Was it for justice, or had it become something darker? Was he trying to protect her, or was he simply too far gone to care about the consequences? One evening, as Jordan sat at his desk, the weight of his choices pressing down on him, he found himself staring at a picture on his desk. It was an old photo of his family, a snapshot of happier times before his job had consumed him, before the darkness of the crematorium had seeped into his soul. He had once believed in right and wrong, in the value of honesty, in the sanctity of life. But now, with the threat of his involvement in a web of lies, corruption, and murder hanging over him, he didn't know what was right anymore. Should he continue digging, knowing that the more he uncovered, the more he would lose? Should he risk everything, his career, his freedom, even his life, just to reveal the truth? Or should he walk away, bury the truth, and try to return to the life he had known, pretending he had never been involved in the conspiracy in the first place? The decision weighed heavily on him. He had never considered himself a man of action, more of a bystander, watching life unfold around him. But now he realized that the only way forward was through action, and it terrified him. As he sat there, lost in thought, Clara called. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that Jordan hadn't heard before. "Have you made up your mind?" she asked. "We don't have much time." Jordan took a deep breath, the suffocating pressure of the situation making it hard to think clearly. He wanted to say no. He wanted to walk away, leave it all behind. But there was something inside him, a sense of justice, or maybe just guilt, that wouldn't let him. He owed it to Clara. He owed it to himself. "I'm in," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos inside him. "I'll help you finish this." Clara was silent for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was tinged with something that almost sounded like relief. "Good. We're not done yet, but we will be soon." Jordan's heart pounded as he set the phone down. He had made his choice. There was no turning back now. The decision to press on had been made, but it didn't bring Jordan the peace he had hoped for. In fact, it made everything worse. The more he thought about it, the less certain he became. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't think. Every time he closed his eyes, all he could see was the mess he had gotten himself into. The faces of the people who had trusted him, his colleagues, his family, even Clara, began to blur together. He wasn't sure if he could continue living in this shadow, with the weight of the lies pressing down on him at every turn. The pressure was breaking him. He found himself walking the hallways of the crematorium, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He had always prided himself on his ability to handle the dead. But now, it was as though the dead were starting to haunt him. Each body he handled, each case he filed, felt like a constant reminder of the choices he had made. Choices that were too late to undo. He couldn't run anymore. Not from the truth. Not from the consequences. Not from himself. As Jordan walked to the back of the crematorium, he realized that he was standing at the breaking point. The truth was within his reach, but so was everything he had worked for. And he had to decide which mattered more, exposing the lies or saving himself. The cold wind howled through the narrow streets outside the crematorium, rattling the windows of Jordan's small office. Inside, the stillness was almost suffocating, thick with the weight of his choices. He hadn't expected to end up here, trapped in a tangled web of lies, deceit, and betrayal. Yet, somehow here he was, standing at the precipice, with only a razor-thin line separating him from the abyss. Clara had been relentless. She was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. And now, after everything, Jordan realized that he had been just as consumed by the need to know as she was. They were in this together, their fates intertwined, the past and present crashing together like waves. The day before, Clara had slipped out of the crematorium in the dead of night, leaving behind nothing but the promise of finality. "We'll take them down," she had whispered, her eyes burning with a quiet fury. This ends now. But now, standing alone in the dim office, Jordan felt the crushing weight of their plan. They were about to make their final move. The criminals responsible for Nathaniel's death, for the vast conspiracy that stretched across the city, were closer than ever. The last thread of truth was just within reach. And yet, with it came the terrifying realization. Once they pulled the trigger, there would be no going back. The moment arrived in the dead of night when the crematorium was empty, and the only sounds were the distant hum of city traffic and the creaks of the building settling. Jordan and Clara had made their plan: infiltrate the organization, gather evidence, and destroy it from within. But the criminals weren't idiots. They knew they were being hunted, and they weren't about to let two outliers derail everything they'd spent years building. Jordan stood at the back door of the crematorium, the cold steel of the door cutting through his fingers as he gripped it tightly. Clara's message had been clear: we meet tonight. The final confrontation. Everything changes after this. And so it did. Clara appeared from the shadows, her face hidden beneath the hood of her jacket, her movements sharp and deliberate. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small device, a tracker, something that would help them pinpoint the exact location of the meeting. "They'll come," she said quietly, her voice a low murmur. "We'll be ready." Jordan nodded, though his stomach churned. The risks were greater than ever now. This wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. This was about survival. Hours later, their plan was in motion. Clara had managed to get them inside the heart of the criminal operation, a hidden facility tucked away beneath a nondescript building. It was there, in that cold, sterile environment, where the final confrontation would take place. The criminals, led by a ruthless figure who had always been one step ahead of them, arrived in full force. Their faces were unreadable, their eyes cold, as if they had seen everything and had nothing left to fear. But Jordan could see the cracks in their armor: fear, doubt, the unmistakable signs that they knew their empire was crumbling. Jordan and Clara, armed with the evidence they had painstakingly gathered, stepped forward to face them. The tension was thick in the air as the two sides locked eyes. The criminals were cornered, and they knew it. This was the moment when everything would either shatter or fall into place. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," one of the men sneered, stepping forward. His voice dripped with venom. Jordan's breath caught in his throat. This was it, the point of no return. He looked at Clara, who stood beside him, unflinching. The weight of the past few weeks, the lies, the deaths, the danger, it all culminated in this one moment. He had no idea if they would make it out alive, but there was no turning back now. With one swift motion, Clara raised her hand, signaling the beginning of their final stand. The criminals had underestimated them. They had no idea how far Jordan and Clara had come, how much they had already sacrificed. The trap was set, and now it was time to close it. A series of quick decisions, precise actions, and calculated risks followed. The criminals fought back, but they were disorganized, unprepared for the ambush. The evidence they had accumulated was enough to destabilize their entire operation, and the law would be on their doorstep in hours. As the dust settled, Jordan stood in the midst of it, panting, heart racing. Clara was beside him, her face illuminated by the dim lights overhead, her expression unreadable. The fight was over. They had won. But the cost of victory was steep. Lives had been lost. Trust had been shattered. And nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed were a blur of media coverage, police investigations, and relentless pressure from all sides. The criminal organization that had operated in the shadows for so long was finally brought to its knees. The web of deceit that had ensnared so many was unraveled, and the truth about Nathaniel Voss's death was exposed for the world to see. But as the world turned its gaze to the wreckage of a criminal empire, Jordan couldn't shake the feeling that his own world was crumbling as well. The ashes he had cremated, the bodies he had handled, the lies he had buried, All of it had left him hollow, uncertain. Clara had vanished. After their final encounter, she had disappeared into the night, leaving Jordan to face the consequences alone. He had expected it, in a way. Clara had always been a shadow, slipping in and out of his life when he least expected it. Her mission was complete, and she had no more use for him. As the days turned into weeks, Jordan found himself drifting through life, unable to find the peace he had longed for. His career had been upended, his reputation forever tainted by his involvement in the conspiracy. The crematorium, once a place where he had felt a sense of control, now felt like a prison. He couldn't shake the images of the bodies he had cremated, of the lives he had destroyed without meaning to. But there was one thing he knew for sure. The truth, no matter how dark, was finally out in the open. And no matter how much it haunted him, he had no choice but to live with it. Jordan stood at the edge of the crematorium one last time, the weight of everything he had done settling over him like a shroud. The world had changed, and so had he. The lies were buried, but their legacy would follow him forever. The question now was not whether he could escape it, but whether he could ever live with it.